Well, I have met Grad a couple of times in Toronto. I know you've lived and worked there many years, and you're more recently involved with a group called Anthroposophy in Toronto, and you're doing lots of wonderful things in Toronto, I've heard, and yeah, bringing anthroposophy out into the city and primarily to the people downtown who live there. Is that true, Grant?
That's the goal, if the government allows us to meet in public, which we seem to have just reached that point again.
Well, I think we're just all really glad that you're going to do 2 sessions on this subject. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Susan. So as you alluded, I'd much rather be meeting with you folks in person, and I have been over the last few months called to talk about hierarchies frequently. So I hope that those of you that have heard me talk don't get tired of the same anecdotes. I'm going to change my focus this time and try to spend a bit more time on some more advanced concepts about the hierarchies. I know that I'm talking officially and probably to a large extent to actual members of the Anthroposophical Society in Canada, perhaps elsewhere. And those people already have a fairly varied but strong background in basic anthroposophical concepts. So I don't want to dwell on those things, but I'm not going to skip over entirely, because any of you that haven't focused in any way on the hierarchies, I think you should be given a chance to have a rapid catch-up. So I will start with the more anecdotal and general concepts, and then I will focus today on the constitution of the hierarchies, the individual hierarchies and their different constitutions. We'll see what that means. And then on the consciousness of the hierarchies. So I advertised this as a way to get to know the individual groups of higher beings. I come across simplification so often that angels are just bigger, smarter humans with wings, and archangels have another set of wings. And when you get high enough, they have a bunch of eyes, and it's really a very materialistic concept of higher beings. I hope to disabuse you all of that over the next hour and give you Rudolf Steiner's information on how those beings exist and interact with our world. That is the focus today, how they interact, how we can interact with them in our world today. And then the focus on the part 2, which is in a few weeks from now, will be how did we get here? What's the anthroposophical explanation for where these higher beings came from and how they may have changed in their evolution? And then also, where are we going? Not only the higher beings, but ourselves. What is the anthroposophical description of the future of mankind, and how do these higher beings play into that? And in fact, what is their future from their own perspective, as much as a human can understand that? So that's part 2. So part 1, I'm going to focus on how things present themselves today. And mostly I'll be focusing on text from Steiner. So I don't have lots of pretty pictures to keep you awake. You're going to have to manage by listening to me or turning your video off if you can't manage that. One way or the other, you're going to hear a lot of talk from me with a few diagrams. We're going back to the old days when Steiner had a blackboard and he didn't have any other fancy entertainment devices. So that's always been my style, and that's what we'll have to put up with today. Let me just get things in order. Okay, I'll start with a few anecdotes. Some of these may be familiar to you, but just to position what is a spiritual being. And Is anthroposophy the only way to know them? Of course not. There's plenty of discussion now. When I was young, it was fairy tales. Now it's new age. There's plenty of discussion of spirit and spirit beings and other aspects of the non-physical world. And I used to be allowed to travel. So when I traveled, I came across these aspects of society in many countries in different ways. In Iceland, it's very explicit. People acknowledge the elemental beings, the beings that are part of nature. They acknowledge them, they accommodate them. There is a place called the Fairy Village where they don't move rocks out of the way to build buildings because that's a fairy rock and that rock takes precedence. You don't move it, you would disturb the elementals. So they just leave a rock there, even if it might be a prime building area. When I was in Japan, I spent a while with a religious group, one of the new Shinto sects, and they're very much nature oriented. And I inquired into the history of their founding, one of the newer sects in Japan, and it had been founded in the late 1800s. And the description of their founder and the God that he spoke to, the God that his revelations came from, that God had almost a perfect correspondence to our description of Michael, the Archangel. And their founding was at the time when Michael had completed his down-throwing of the backward angels and completed his transfer of cosmic consciousness. So I'm jumping around a bit. Some of you may have all of these references in your head, but that's not the focus today. Just the idea that in Japan, there is a sect of Shintoism that is very clearly, in my mind, founded by Michael, the Archangel. So that was an interesting coincidence. We go to any indigenous culture and inquire about how it's different. And one of the big differences is the respect for the spirit in everything. That's a little general sometimes, at least as much as is shared with me, but the spirit in everything is really the source of my interest in the hierarchies. I title or I include in all my talks somehow the esoteric instruction or explanation, the phrase all is being. Everything is being in the spiritual world. It's not a spiritual rock or a spiritual chair. It's a being. Everything is a being, including the words that I'm creating are being created and carried by elementals. So everything in the spiritual world is a being. And the indigenous cultures often have a clear consciousness of this. I was teaching in Vietnam for a month, the foundation studies a few years back. And just for my amusement, I stopped the lesson and I asked them, what are the names of the nature spirits in Vietnamese? And the audience of young Waldorf teachers laughed a little nervously and didn't want to share it. And then when they began to share it, they enthusiastically and in great agreement gave me the names of the beings of the four elements, the leaders of those groups of beings. It was no difficulty at all for the Vietnamese to pull this from their culture. So that kind of respect for the spiritual world is common around the world. And we in our pride of following the science have put that aside a lot. Well, I'm going to bring you the science on these beings from Rudolf Steiner, the teachings that he's given us from his vast and tremendously disciplined clairvoyant capacities. I'm not claiming that I can vouch all of these from personal experience, but I have certainly worked with the concepts, and I hope that sharing them with you will expand your picture of the spiritual world and how you engage with it in your daily life, I think even. So let's start with the names. The hierarchies are grouped into a set of typically 9 groups of beings. Most of you will find these or some of these names quite familiar, but I will start with them nonetheless, just so that we know we're all in the same place. You should be seeing a document. You may have to move the panel of people's faces off to the edge, push it off to the side so that you can see the whole chart. This is a chart I did decades ago, in which the middle column is of the most interest. And that's the column that has the typically Greek names that Steiner and other anthroposophists used, especially in the early days when he was talking to theosophists. But also we continue to use names like Archai and sometimes Dynamis. Those words, thrones, of course, come either from the Greek or from the more ancient, I can almost say, Christian names. So Dionysius the Areopagita was a writer in the 5th century, approximately the 5th century AD, and he produced a piece of literature called the Celestial Hierarchies. And in that document, he named all of the 9 levels. So the agreement has been maintained from Dionysius' time through Anthroposophy that these beings can be grouped into 9 levels. So we have the familiar angels, archangels, and archai, and that's clustered into a single hierarchy, the 3rd hierarchy. Sometimes I'll talk about individual classes of beings like angels, and other times I'll talk about a group of beings into a hierarchy. Steiner names and numbers these 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, closest to us, the 3rd, with the archai, archangels, and angels. But he gave all of these groups of beings modern names, which at first glance would always throw me. And I would think, that's hard to remember. Spirits of twilight, spirits of fire. I'm just calling them angels and archangels. But after a while, after quite a while, I guess, I started becoming familiar with his names and realizing the wisdom that was embedded in these names. Spirits of form, spirits of motion, spirits of wisdom have duties or aspects that Steiner describes throughout the vast material that he offers us. They have duties that relate to the name he gave them. So the spirits of form have forming duties, even beyond the solar system of the Earth. They have forming duties all the way back to the ancient Saturn that I'll talk about in the next get-together. The cosmology of anthroposophy covers vast periods of time, and the spirits of form have had duties that relate to forming all the way through that description. The spirits of motion, similarly. So sometimes we use the other names, the Dynamis, the Exousiai, the Elohim, and if you were a Christian scholar, you might use names like revelations and mights and dominions. Those names are all clearly associated with a particular group. But Steiner also gave us occasionally direct relationships between these names and the names of other religious traditions. In the case of Mahapurusha, a Hindu tradition. In the case of Amshaspans, a Persian tradition. So Steiner was able, I was able in some cases to find in Steiner's material places where he said, these two are the same. And so I've included them when it was quite clear that he was saying these two are the same. It's not always. There are many times when it's confusing and I'm not clear which level he's referring to, or not clear enough certainly to put it onto a chart. But all of these, I actually have links that link to particular passages in Steiner's literature, where he said Barashad Pitris are the same as angels. So interesting breadth of Steiner's knowledge, how he could bring in other religions and show that this is not something that he was making up. It's something that has been recognized in ancient wisdom for a very long time, perhaps much longer than our history can show to us. So the ancient wisdom agrees to a large extent with the structure that Steiner offers us today. In many cases, it's not as elaborate, or the remainders that we get to see today of the Persian esoterica are not as elaborate as today. But in other cases, Hindu, for instance, still has an enormous structure that can be described, unfortunately, differently in various sects, but an enormous structure to the spiritual world that Steiner also points to. And I should point out that this chart doesn't include the elementals. So all of these beings can be considered to be more advanced, have a longer history, and have greater capacity than the human being. And the animals, plants, and minerals have a shorter developmental history than the human being. But in addition to that, there are the elemental beings, which we don't normally recognize in our physical world, but Steiner says absolutely exist and are the foundation of the physical world itself. The beings that could be grouped as the gnomes, the sylphs, the undines, and the salamanders. They all have a spiritual aspect, but the elemental beings do not have an ego. So we shouldn't really think of them as spiritual beings, but rather as, as elemental spirits, but rather as elemental beings. It will direct us to remember that there's aspects of the elementals that are quite different than the higher hierarchies, including us, in which the ego is active. So very important that we take that whole picture into our minds when we think of the spiritual worlds. We have levels of a human being, starting from the physical and moving up through a number of levels that we acknowledge as being part of our constitution, and I'll get into that in a moment. But I would like, just quickly, out of this very academic beginning, to talk briefly about more friendly anecdotes, ways that I interact with these beings. I don't claim to have a clairvoyance, and certainly I don't know anyone who can claim to have a clairvoyance approaching Rudolf Steiner's level of discipline and capacity. But I can interact with, and you can interact with, these spiritual beings every day in ways that we don't acknowledge as being in touch with the spirit in our modern culture, but are quite real. So I can be engaging with an angel or an archangel when I'm moving through an area, some geography. When I go to my country home, I always acknowledge the archangel of the lake. Everything around me that I love about my country home is dependent on that lake. And I acknowledge that there is an overseeing archangel, maybe a rather junior one, but an archangel overseeing that lake. When I land in the old days when I could, when I land in a new country, the first thing I do when I touch the ground is I reach out to try to meet the archangel. I land in Beijing or Reykjavik, Iceland, and the feeling immediately is extremely different. I'm in a new place, and the new place is overseen by an archangel, and it's possible to get the spirit of the city, the spirit of the country, just by opening your imagination a bit to say, yes, I've now met that place at a spiritual level. And when I come back to Toronto, I have that connection that I didn't have before I stepped foot in that place. Here's a very mundane example that I've used a few times. I was walking on a summer day after days of rain, and I wanted to walk into, I'm in this city, and I wanted to walk into this wilderness area that I so love. It has invasive species grass, but the grass is lovely. It's taller than I am. So I can go into this area and I can't see or hear anything mechanized anymore. I just have a pond in front of me and a bench to sit on and grass surrounding me in every direction. So I really enjoy this place. But as I said, it had been raining tremendously. So I'm walking around in my running shoes. Should I go down into this park and come out with my feet halfway up to my knees covered in mud? Not a great idea. That's what typically happens in that area after it rains a lot. So I'm standing there staring at the grass and the path that disappears into it, trying to figure out, I wonder how muddy it is in there. Can I go in or not? I'm not doing anything. I'm just sort of standing looking at it. And then a puff of wind comes up and the grass parts. It just spreads apart. The grass has very clearly answered my question in my mind. Should I enter? Yes, of course, please come in, says the grass and the wind. Well, is this just a silly fairy tale that I'm writing in my mind? I don't think so. I think that that was an interaction with the beings of that place saying, come on in, you're welcome. No, you won't be covered in mud. And it turned out it wasn't too deep. I could easily walk with running shoes and enjoy myself for a while. So those kind of lovely little examples of the spiritual world will talk to you if you're willing to listen. And of course, my totally materialistic brother-in-law would say, you're wasting my time. Don't bother to talk about this stuff. But for me, it really improved and enriched my day to know that I'd been in contact briefly with the spirits of that park. And it still sticks with me. Even sillier examples, I am often in a forest and I look up and it may be a very still day with no wind. And so nothing is moving. So I look up and admire the trees and I say nothing is moving, but there's an exception. One leaf dangling on a tree is just doing this. I'm a scientist. Why should I pay any attention to this? But it's so lovely when I see the forest just giving me a little wave. It just sits there and dangles, no wind, just the one leaf just moving back and forth. I'm sure that you can do that too. If you go into any natural environment with your heart open, these things can talk to you. When I talk to people about how the archangels rule the seasons, it enriches a lot of people's lives to think there's a lot more going on than just the inclination of the earth and how much sunlight is striking the surface. That there's so much richness brought from the pictures that Steiner gave us of the seasons and the meaning of each of the imaginations for the 4 seasons. So it makes a life richer and more artistic, shall we say. And that's why I'm an anthroposophist, because I grew up through many other esoteric traditions, and then closest to discovering anthroposophy, I spent a decade in theosophy. All the same concepts there, but none of the heart, none of the art. Theosophy doesn't have any of that. Anthroposophy does. So if we can bring that into our daily lives, isn't it lovely? However, you're now going to endure me talking as a bit of an academic, because I'm going to offer you descriptions of the hierarchies given by Steiner from a couple of very particular aspects. And so the first one, I need to remind us about the constitutions the components of a human being. So I'm going to share another document. So as human beings, we can consider ourselves, we're told that we can consider ourselves as having 7 components or levels or aspects. Number 1 being the physical. And as anthroposophists, we know that the difference between a human being and a corpse is not physical. The difference between a human being and a corpse is that a human being, a living human being, has life. And that is described as the etheric component of a human being. So we are living human beings, but we are not living human beings comatose in a bed. We are living human beings that have emotions and move around the world. Unlike plants and unlike rocks, we can move around the world and have emotional interactions with it, the same as animals can. So we are given the term for that component of ourselves, the astral. So we have 3 components which we share with the animals. But then, and this is quite important, that anthroposophy clarifies it in so many ways, and we can experience through exercises and thought exercises as well, that we are different from animals in that we have an I. We have the ability to think and say I. And Steiner tells us that were we clairvoyant and were we interested in listening to a disciplined clairvoyance testimony, we would be able to recognize that animals cannot do that, that animals are much more of a group, that animals are what we would think in human terms as much more tribal, that animals, in fact, don't think about themselves as much as they do about the group they're part of, and that they don't preserve that distinct individuality. Some of your house pets may develop quite a personality, and we could say, well, that cat is quite distinct from all other cats. But Steiner tells us beyond that, that they don't contain the ego component and therefore can't preserve that individuality. And so when they die, that individuality is just consumed by the cat ego, which is not part of your individual cat. But us, we are told we can preserve our individuality and come back with all the strengths and weaknesses that we've developed from the past life and bring them back to this life. So that no 2 people are the same, even if they are identical twins raised in the same family, they almost immediately begin to express uniqueness. And they certainly, as they grow, express uniqueness. There's something beyond environment and genetics that's involved in a human being. And that we can say is the ego. And then beyond that are aspects of us that we are told, but typically we don't have the capacity to function in yet. And so therefore don't have a good consciousness of it. These are aspects that are named the manas, the buddhi, and the atma, or the spirit self, the life spirit, and the spirit man. These are aspects that I won't spend much time on if I'm talking about a human, unless we try to acknowledge that our current task is to begin to develop the spirit self. The mass of humanity at the moment is not quite there. They're still working on their soul aspects and their consciousness soul. But if we can master that, then our next task, and some of us in anthroposophy may set our sights on that even in this life, is to develop the capacity to function in the spirit self. And so that's important because of our future development. But it's also important if we compare this, and I will stop for a moment while I readjust my notes. If we compare that diagram that we just saw to the diagram that Steiner gives us for an angel. He tells us that the diagram we just saw the human, everything is interconnected, and it's quite important to recognize that a human really has all of its aspects, anything that's developed sufficiently for us to function in, all of them are interconnected and can be brought to bear on the physical world. So you can look at a human and see or perceive or in some way connect to that human being's vitality, that human being's emotions, even that human being's individuality. We have the senses among our 12 senses to engage even to the level of the ego. That's a noble human being. I would follow that person anywhere. That person really throws me. I'm dealing with the astrality of that person and I'm not comfortable. That person is just so vital. I can't imagine that he will ever get old. And the opposite, of course, I've had the experience a number of times of being with a loved one and holding her hand the moment she dies. And so at that point, I can experience the difference between the living human being and the human being in which the vitality has left. So those are things we can all perceive in a human being. They're all connected. Here's the picture, I'll show it to you now, of the angel. Oops, well, I won't, I'll get it in a moment. I'm just jumping between screens. So here's the picture of the angel. So the angel has a break in the middle. Steiner tells us that the constitution of an angel is not the same as the human being. Sometimes we imagine in our speculations that everything is just like us, shifted up one. So the angel just drops number 1 and gets a number 8. And some of Steiner's lectures suggest that that part is true. But here he's talking about the way in which a being engages with us and how we can engage with them from our physical perspective. We're physical beings, unless we're clairvoyant, we can deal with the physical. The angel, he tells us, still has all of these 7 aspects, even including the physical body. Of course, the angel is functioning much more effectively in the life spirit, in the spirit self than we are. The angel has moved its consciousness into that level and is working with the spiritual world in a very different way than we are, but still has an ego, still has astral, etheric, and physical, but in a way that the angel is no longer, or in fact, perhaps never has, a direct connection between the angel's ego and the lower components of the physical. The angel's ego is as if it's floating above a physical body, as if it's reflecting itself into the physical, rather than a human being that is completely and totally engaged at every level, including the chakras interconnecting the bodies, so that our senses and our astral being are connected, our physical and well, let's use the astral again. Our astral and the ego are directly connected, that they influence each other. So those in the human being connections don't exist in angelic beings. It's a strange, very abstract picture, but what does it mean? It means that the angel can influence a physical, etheric, astral body without being, without inhabiting it. And so, what does he tell us about that in terms of what it means to be physically an angel, the physical side of being an angel? The higher parts, I'm now going to quote a couple of things. If you want to be clear about the nature of an angel, you must think that his higher parts float above that part of him which is in the physical world. His physical part is something like a mirrored reflection of his spiritual principles, which are to be found only in the spiritual world. So just elaborating on that, if we wanted to understand this, the angel's eye and spirit self in the way that Steiner could. We would have to look through the physical and be able to reach clairvoyantly a separate level. We couldn't just progressively move through as we would with a human. We have to actually find a separate being almost, and then we can engage with the spiritual aspects. So the ego and the higher components don't engage directly in the physical world. So how does an angel engage in the physical world? What's physical about an angel? It's certainly not a physical angel like a statue of an angel would be, but we have examples. We have an example, for instance, in the New Testament where the people are attempting to be in the healing pool at the right time of year when the angel will flow across the waters and heal them. And Jesus Christ comes to them and heals them outside of that. So all the people know that that pool of water is a place where an angel will inhabit. And when that happens, they could be cured. So they will flock to that pool waiting for the moment, not knowing when the angel is going to engage. Steiner said that's quite accurate. In flowing, I'm quoting again, in flowing and running water, in mists dissolving in water, also in winds and the lightning flashing through the air. In all of these, you have to look for the physical body of angelic beings. So angels can engage with liquid, with water, with air, with fire, like lightning. All of those can be temporary engagements of the angel with the physical world. And given that the etheric and the astral are there, these can be quite enlivened engagements. In the past, people could see physically angels in the mists. I can imagine that in Atlantean times, when the air was so humid that you couldn't see the stars, that the angels could become more visible to us. He gives an example. 80 angels may be associated with and have the most solid part of their physical body in some one sheet of water. So angels can engage and disengage with the watery element as well as the airy and warmth elements of the earth. Because they're not that far from the earth, they have the physical earth, I should say. They have the astral and the etheric engaged together with this. So they have the ability to come all the way down in the form that a moon being would have, an ancient moon being, where there was no solid, but the moon being could engage with the fluid, the airy and the warmth elements of that solar system. The angels have retained that capacity. So it's quite realistic to expect that you might, in some unusual circumstance, be able to acknowledge the presence of an angel. Maybe not that unusual, maybe we just ignore them. When that breath of air pushed aside the tall grass for me, that was, in my mind, a clear action of a spiritual being. And Steiner said angels have that capacity. They can engage all the way from the fluid right up through the gas and the warmth. Okay, I'll let you watch me scroll this time. I have notes that I'm going to post with the video when it's posted, so you can see all the notes that I'm speaking from. Here's the Archangel picture. A gap again, but a gap at a different level. The Archangel has been able to maintain a connection to, or establish a connection, I'm not sure which way to describe that, to the astral. So the Archangel is working from the astral right through all of the aspects that we understand, and in fact, two beyond that, but still has a connection to the etheric and physical. The same way that when the archangels established their individuality on ancient sun, and I'll be going through that next presentation in more depth, they had the ability to engage with both the etheric and the physical. And so what does that mean today? Again, an archangel is not physically present on earth, but has a reflection on the earth, but not a reflection that can penetrate as deeply as an angel. A reflection on earth that's let's say, motivated by the etheric and the physical. So a physical, and I'll quote now from Steiner, a physical and etheric body can only unite when the physical consists of air or fire. For instance, you could not perceive the physical bodies of archangels rushing in the water, but you could perceive them in the air, I'm adding. So an archangel is a being that can have an influence on the world, but only through the air and the warmth, not through the water. Very interesting. And now let's scroll to the third from us, the archi. And the progression is clear. You're now seeing the archi can incorporate its consciousness into the levels all the way down to etheric, but the physical aspect is only a reflection. It's as if it floats above a physical influence on the earth. And it's such a physical body as this archi would generate can live only in fire. Only in flames of fire or flashes of lightning can you recognize the physical body of the archi. Gives us a strange picture. These beings are not completely divorced from the world that we acknowledge as being real, the physical world. They're not completely divorced from that, but they aren't incorporated in anything that has a solid edge. So an angel could be in a body of water. In fact, he said an angel could be in a number of bodies of water if it so chose simultaneously. 80 angels could be in a body of water as they wished. So an angel can engage with us, but not in a way that will typically have a solid form, something that stays and we can look at it and say, there's the edge of the angel and no farther. The pictures that artists can draw certainly call on more than just the physical. They may call on the etheric sight, the form that allows the angel to pull that together into a watery or airy or warmth form. Even the archi has the capacity to pull together a physical, but that would only be in the warmth, in the lightning, in the flashing of a lightning strike. I wonder, when I'm staring into the burning logs in my fire, in my wood stove, do I have any connection to the archi? I'm not sure. I certainly have a feeling that there's a connection to the archi elementals, and I'll talk about that in a moment. What's the connection between elementals and higher beings? The next step up, the exousiae. I didn't do a diagram for them because they have no physical component. The exousiae, the Elohim, the spirits of form, the gods of Genesis, those are all the same class of beings. They have no physical form. They form the physical from the spiritual world. So how can Steiner perceive or talk about the beings of the second hierarchy, the spirits of form, the spirits of motion, the spirits of wisdom? Steiner tells us that we can't perceive those in any way with the first level of clairvoyance, imagination. If we achieve control over our imaginative forces and we can call up the level of perception embedded in imagination, we won't have any connection to the exousiae, the spirits of form. We need to develop the next level of clairvoyance or consciousness, control over our levels of consciousness. We need to develop the level of imagination. And when we can function at the level of imagination, then we can contact or perceive the presence of exousiae. already at the level of archi, Steiner gives us a little comment that has stuck with me and most people who hear it. If you attempted in your clairvoyance to connect to an archi, that's not really the singular term, an archa, then you would experience this being as if you were a grain of wheat being ground in its teeth. You would have such a little significance to that being as if you were a grain of wheat being ground in its teeth. What an experience that Steiner relates to someone who's dealing with contact with archi. And yet we ask, well, what's next? As humans always do. And the next is the level at which your clairvoyance or control of consciousness is so powerful that you can engage with the world through through inspiration. And if you engage with inspiration, then you can reach out to a being that doesn't have in any way physical components. So you can't work your way from the physical, the blue of the sky, the green of the grass. We have exercises like that. Start with the physical and work your way to the imagination. You can't do that at the second hierarchy level. And to engage beyond anything I can imagine in this lifetime with the beings of the first hierarchy, the spirits of will, the cherubim, the seraphim, you must have achieved control of your consciousness to be able to engage at the level of intuition. So I'm willing to take Steiner's word for that. That's as far as I can push that material from personal experience. So a few more aspects of the higher beings. And let's drop down to elementals for a moment. Consciousness. So elementals have no ego. So they will typically be functioning at the level of consciousness similar to a being like an animal that is a group, that has clearly a group soul outside of itself. And the components of elementals do not go as high as the ego. Steiner describes them in some detail. I won't get into that today, but there's some lovely diagrams and descriptions of how gnomes are, constitution is different from sylphs, which is different from undines, and ultimately quite different from salamanders, who are closest to us, but not the same constitution. So as a scientist of the spirit, I find all this fascinating. I'm not sure everybody wants to follow through the details of A and B and part of B and a C that's pseudo ego, etc. But Steiner gives us a lot to work with there. I'm going to focus just on the hierarchies, the higher hierarchies. So what's the consciousness of an angel? Does the angel wake up and go to sleep the way we do? We wake up and engage with the world, with our senses. We go to sleep and we don't engage with the physical world with our senses. We dream and we have vast periods of time, me especially, where nothing seems to happen. There aren't dreams, I just wake up. And that was a while after I went to sleep, hopefully 8 hours. And what happened in between, I have no consciousness of it. So I have these two very different periods of waking and sleeping. Is that the way the angels work? So Steiner tells us, no, not at all. The angels have a consciousness that has two aspects to it. And in fact, the angels and the archangels and the archi could be said to share in this description I'm about to give you. What we have in waking consciousness is in them a manifestation of themselves. So it's as if we could say, what I know, I can perceive. What is true, I can perceive. But beyond that, I can't perceive something that isn't true. I can't perceive something that I don't know. it's as if the angels, and I'm using human physical language to describe something that's neither human nor physical. It's as if the angels created their world, that when they perceive, they are actually manifesting, and he uses the word manifest. They're manifesting the world they live in. So angels cannot manifest something that isn't true. At least the healthy, normal angels cannot manifest something that isn't true. So an angel, and we're not talking about backward beings at this moment, but an angel cannot lie. An angel can only engage with what is true for the angel. It manifests its world. What happens when an angel does something equivalent to our going to sleep? So when we go to sleep, Steiner tells us lots of things are happening. My experience is a big blank, and then I wake up. Well, what happens when the angel withdraws from the manifested world, what we would call wakeful consciousness, and draws into itself? It has inner experience. And the inner experience is being filled with the spirit, as if the beings higher than it are filling it. So the angel, when it is asleep, and that's of course not the right word, is engaging internally with the higher world. It's filled with spirit. So the two types of consciousness that an angel, archangel, and archai engage with are manifesting the world and moving throughout the world because they've created it, but only to themselves. It seems very strange, like, are angels all actors and they're making it up? No, they're projecting their truth into the world. And then when they withdraw from that world, they are filled with and can interact with the higher spirit internally. Not sure if that makes a functional picture for you. I've worked with it for quite a while and it's intriguing. So let's add to that and go farther from a human. How do the second hierarchy, consciousness, function? What happens when a spirit of form, a dynami, a kyriotite, wakes up? What is awake or waking consciousness for a being of that second hierarchy? So for the third hierarchy, they manifest themselves, they realize themselves, they create themselves. What the beings of the second hierarchy do is they create life, they stimulate life. So they're not creating themselves out in the world anymore. They're now creating life. So it's as if they're creating other beings. And it's not even as if, but in fact, they are creating the world of other beings. I'm trying to find a description of what happens when they pull back. So the most important aspect of pulling back is that they've let go of their waking consciousness. And when they let go of their waking consciousness, the creations that they have produced cease. So those creations exist only so long as the beings of the second hierarchy are conscious of them. So what they create is temporary. And when they pull back, their creations cease to exist to lower beings like us. That allows me to distinguish the second from the first. The first hierarchy, the thrones, the cherubim, the seraphim, also engage in creation, but they create entire worlds and the beings that make up those worlds. And those beings that the first hierarchy create are independent of them and persist and continue within the world when the first hierarchy beings cease to focus their consciousness on that world they've created, when they pull inwards. So the first hierarchy is quite special because it has the closest connection to the Godhead. And the first hierarchy is described as bathing within the Trinity. The first hierarchy is entirely directed by the purpose and the will and the plan of the Trinity. The first hierarchy engages, you could even say, with no possibility of disengaging in the will of the Trinity. We are second, first, and then humans farther and farther from connection to that aspect of reality. But the first hierarchy are bathing in it constantly. They are so close that they have essentially no ability to be or understand freedom. This will ultimately be a task for human beings. I'll talk about next meeting. So if this second hierarchy and third hierarchy can create beings, how about the second hierarchy and the first hierarchy can create beings? How about the first hierarchy? Is it, I'm getting my numbers mixed up. First, second, third. How about the third hierarchy, angels, archangels, archi? Can they create? They can create offspring, beings that split off from themselves, beings that they remain responsible for. And very interestingly, the third hierarchy is the group of beings that create the elementals. So the elementals are dependent on the third hierarchy for their existence. And it may initially be counterintuitive that the highest of the third hierarchy, the archi, have an offspring that is the most physical, the gnomes. And the second of the third hierarchy, the archangels, have the offspring that is the next most physical from the gnomes, the undines. And then the angels have the offspring of the sylphs. So the creation of this ecology that we live in is so interrelated, and the dependency of the beings in that hierarchy, in that ecology even of the spiritual world, is fascinating. We'll speak next time about backwards beings. So what happens if an angel, an archangel, an archi goes backward? Does it have offspring? It certainly does, and those are important as well in the ecology of the spiritual world and ultimately its manifestation. The physical world that we know couldn't function without all of these offspring of the higher beings. It's as if the higher beings are the architects and the offspring are the workmen. And the reason that I can sit on this couch and speak these words is that all of these workmen are available for me to function in the physical world. The second hierarchy also has offspring. And I've often wondered about this over the decades. Where do the group souls fit into this picture of the 9 hierarchies? Are the group souls archangels? Seems like maybe they should be, but Steiner never quite says that. And then finally, in these 2 books, Spiritual Beings in the Heavenly Bodies and Kingdoms of Nature, the ones I put into the chat, and Spiritual Hierarchies of the Physical World, Steiner says very clearly in a chart, the offspring of the second hierarchy are the group souls. So these group souls are not a normal evolving evolution of the 9 hierarchies. These are a creation of the second hierarchy. Group souls created, functioning as the anchor for an animal species, the anchor for a collection of perhaps a genus of plants, the anchor for a group of minerals. These are group souls that allow these elementals to function in the world and can maintain the kingdoms that we depend on in our physical world. And something that's even less understandable by me at this point, that the offspring of the first hierarchy are beings that he describes as spirits of the rotation of time. And I've been trying to dig into that in the last few years, and I don't have a lot of solid things to say about the spirits of the rotation of time. But these are beings that are outside of the 9 hierarchies in the normal evolution. So, interesting stuff. I've just given you a lot of words, and I hope that some of you are using your conceptual and imaginative powers to try to make an image out of that, or to make something that holds together. And you can say, an angel and an Elohim, they're quite different in so many ways. An angel has offspring that's different from an archangel. An archangel cannot be moving that wave and manifesting in the fog, but an archangel could be the one spreading the branches of that grass apart for me to enter. So I don't know where to take it now. It's close enough to in fact, it's past the hour. So I'd be happy to stop at that point and then pick up next week.
Well, thank you so much, Grant. That was so clear.
Oh, good.
And that lovely picture of trying to connect with the Archangel in a place that we're visiting. I mean, that's a wonderful place where we all can start if we haven't worked at all with the hierarchies or thought much about it.
Yeah, it's regular daily interactions. Look up and see if that leaf is just waving at you. It might be. It's one leaf. How can one leaf be waving when I look? Well,
I just have a thought, a question for you. It's more a personal question, and you've been working with the hierarchies for years, it seems. And how has your life changed by working with these thoughts? Do you feel more in tune with nature? As you say, you can respond to nature. Nature is talking to you.
It certainly, as I said, makes it more artistic to move around in the world. So I acknowledge, probably always have been inclined that way, that nature is significant to me. And I like trees a lot better than people sometimes. So 100 trees is wonderful and 100 people is tiring. So some people like 100 people around them, and they might not engage with the trees the same way. But when I started to look into the way that the spiritual world works as an ecology, that word really works for me. My first degree was zoology. And so way back in the 70s, ecology was becoming cool. And we talk about how different animals interact with each other and how they interact with the plants and the minerals and the weather and all of that stuff in ecology that's so fascinating and rich. Well, I started to engage with the hierarchies as if they're part of the spiritual ecology, the spiritual world. I really always move through anthroposophy with all is being in my head. So anytime I have a question about what is he saying, I try to imagine what the beings are that are engaged in what Steiner is saying. So if there are beings engaged in it, because everything is being, there must be some beings engaged. I get a more and more rich and yet still coherent picture of the spiritual world. So it's real to me. I can talk about it in ways that I'm not just making something up out of a science fiction book that I read, in ways that Steiner offers that just keep completing parts of the puzzle. The puzzle is real. The spiritual world is real. I'm a puzzle doer, so I love to spend hours creating a puzzle. I don't even look at the box. I just assemble things that are similar to each other and then eventually figure out if it's upright or not and turn it around until, oh, it attaches to that other, oh, it attaches to the edge. Wow, now I've got, and finally I finished the puzzle. So I just love putting pictures together like that without understanding where the final answer is until I get there. And that's what happens with my picture of the hierarchies, a picture of the spiritual world, is that every time I learn something, it gives me another piece. And sometimes it attaches beautifully to something else. And once in a while, it attaches that clump of concepts to another clump of concepts. And occasionally I turn it upside down to make it do that. And then finally, I can speak to people in the English language in ways that are respectful of the English language and yet are talking about spiritual concepts. So I think that's my purpose in the world now that I'm an old retired guy, is to try to talk about things using modern English that are so divorced from our material world. But if I use modern English, a lot of people will follow along. So that's what I love, being able to do that better and better. And then, of course, the idea that I can be sitting in such an emotion-filled situation as my wife is passing away, and I can feel the moment that she dies, and I can continue to engage with her after she's died, and I can read to her the following months. Those kind of things that anthroposophy has given me, not purely hierarchical, but real and enriching aspects of my life. Powerful, wonderful. I'll never get depressed, or I'll never get really angry at something, because I have the confidence that the spiritual world and beings so much wiser than I are watching out for me and everyone else. And so somehow things are going to make sense. Maybe I have to do my part, but I really do have an assurance that the old ancient religious people had. You can have that as a modern scientist too, if you dive deep enough into this science of the spirit.
Thank you. So we'll see everybody on the 10th of April,
You
Sunday
bet.